There's a version of World War I that most people carry around in their heads without ever examining it too closely. It involves mud and trenches and poetry and the distant sound of whistles blowing men over the top into the guns. It involves a sense of tragic nobility, of young men marching into an industrial catastrophe that nobody quite understood yet, dying in ways that were terrible but somehow dignified by the sheer scale of the loss. It involves, at its emotional center, a kind of sorrow that feels almost clean, almost literary, almost bearable, because it comes packaged in the language of sacrifice and remembrance and the idea that the suffering meant something. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter, and the parts that are missing are not missing by accident. They were removed carefully, over time, by governments and institutions and medical establishments and families and nations that needed the war to remain comprehensible, needed the dead to remain honorable, needed the living to remain functional. What actually happened in those 4 years between the summer of 1914 and the autumn of 1918 was something that the organizing structures of modern civilization were not designed to process honestly, and so they did not process it honestly. They processed it bureaucratically. They filed it. They categorized it. They gave it names that made it sound like something other than what it was. And then they moved on, and they built memorials, and they held ceremonies, and the deeper truth of what the war actually did to human bodies and human minds and human institutions was allowed to settle quietly beneath the surface of official history, where it has remained largely undisturbed ever since. This is not a story about heroism. This is not a story about sacrifice that redeems itself through meaning. This is a story about what industrialized warfare actually produced when you fed millions of human beings into a system that had no mechanism for stopping itself and no real interest in honestly accounting for what it consumed. The practices that emerged from that system, the things that soldiers and doctors and commanders and governments actually did, the decisions that were made and the decisions that were deliberately not made, the things that were documented and the things that were systematically suppressed. These reveal something about the First World War that the conventional narrative has always struggled to absorb. Not because these things are unknown exactly. Most of them appear somewhere in the historical record if you know where to look. But because they are, taken together, evidence of something that the story of the war as heroic tragedy cannot comfortably contain. They are evidence of a system that had learned to treat human beings as material and had become surprisingly efficient at it. The first thing to understand is the scale of the medical categorization problem that the war created almost immediately. Within weeks of the fighting beginning in earnest, medical officers on all sides were encountering something for which their training had given them essentially no framework. Men were arriving at aid stations who were not physically wounded in any way that showed. No shrapnel, no bullet wounds, no visible injuries at all. And yet they could not speak. They could not stop shaking. Some of them had lost the ability to walk without assistance. Some had gone temporarily blind or deaf with no apparent organic cause. Some were completely unresponsive, sitting in a kind of fixed stillness that looked from the outside like catatonia. The medical establishment of 1914 had categories for physical injury, and it had categories for what it called lunacy, which was understood primarily as a hereditary condition or a product of moral weakness. It did not have a category for what was happening to these men, and the absence of a category created an immediate institutional problem, because men who could not be categorized could not be processed. And men who could not be processed were a bureaucratic obstruction in a medical system that was already overwhelmed by the volume of genuinely physical casualties it was trying to manage. The solution that emerged was not a medical solution. It was an administrative one. The condition was given a name, shell shock, which located its cause in the physical proximity to exploding ordnance and implied a mechanical rather than a psychological origin. This naming was not an accident. A mechanical injury suggested that the man had been damaged by something external, which preserved his status as a functioning soldier who had been temporarily put out of action by enemy action. A psychological explanation would have suggested something more troubling about the soldier himself, about his fitness for service, about the sustainability of putting men through the conditions that were producing these symptoms. The mechanical explanation was more useful to the institutions managing the war, and so it became the official explanation, even as the doctors who were actually treating these men in any depth were becoming increasingly aware that it was inadequate. By 1915, some British military hospitals were housing hundreds of men with shell shock diagnoses. By 1916, after the Battle of the Somme, the numbers had become difficult to manage without acknowledging that something systemic was happening. What was happening, and what the military authorities were extremely reluctant to acknowledge, was that the conditions of trench warfare were producing psychological breakdown at a rate that the system had not anticipated and could not easily absorb. The trenches were not simply physically dangerous. They were psychologically unbearable in ways that accumulated over time. A man might tolerate the first artillery barrage with something like coherent fear. The second and the third might still be survived with functional responses intact. But weeks and months of sustained exposure to artillery bombardment, to the random death of the men around him, to the smell of decay that was simply a constant feature of the trench environment, to the total absence of any sense of progress or purpose or end, produced changes in the human nervous system that nobody in 1914 had predicted and nobody in authority particularly wanted to document honestly. The documentation that did emerge was frequently altered before it reached higher command, because accurate documentation of the psychological collapse of frontline soldiers would have raised uncomfortable questions about the conditions producing it, and those conditions were precisely the conditions that military strategy required to be sustained. Men who broke down under artillery bombardment were handled in ways that varied considerably, depending on rank and nationality and the specific attitudes of the officers around them. A British officer who showed signs of psychological collapse was likely to be quietly rotated out of the line and sent to a hospital, where his condition might be treated with some degree of clinical attention, depending on who was running the facility. A British private who showed the same symptoms was significantly more likely to be classified as a malingerer, to be subjected to military discipline rather than medical treatment, and in the worst cases, to be executed. The British Army shot 306 of its own soldiers during the war, the majority of them for desertion or cowardice. Many of these men were almost certainly suffering from what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The medical opinions submitted at their courts-martial were frequently cursory, sometimes clearly false, and in a number of documented cases, the examining medical officer had spent less than 10 minutes with the accused before declaring him fit to be tried. These were not anomalies. They were the result of a system that had decided, at the institutional level, that the deterrent effect of execution was more valuable than any individual soldier's life or mental health, and that the medical profession's role in that system was to support the deterrent rather than to complicate it. The relationship between the military medical establishment and the command structure during the First World War was one of the most consequential and least examined aspects of the war's institutional history. Medical officers in the field were not independent practitioners. They were military officers who were subject to military authority and who understood that their careers depended on their usefulness to the command structure rather than on their advocacy for individual patients. A medical officer who documented too many cases of shell shock in his unit might find himself accused of encouraging malingering. A medical officer who raised concerns about the conditions his men were being kept in might find those concerns noted and filed and ignored, and his own performance reviews quietly adjusted. The most successful medical officers in the institutional sense were those who found ways to keep men in the line, or to return them to the line as quickly as possible, regardless of what those men's actual medical conditions suggested about their fitness to be there. This pressure operated at every level of the medical hierarchy and produced a systematic tendency toward underreporting of psychological casualties that has made accurate historical assessment of the war's mental health impact essentially impossible. What the available records do show, even with their systematic underreporting, is that the numbers were staggering. The British Army alone received over 80,000 cases of shell shock over the course of the war, and that figure almost certainly represents a fraction of the actual number of men who were psychologically damaged by their service. The German military, which used the term Kriegszitterer, war trembler, for similar presentations, handled its cases through a system of electrical stimulation therapy that was understood at the time to be painful and was described in some contemporary accounts as brutal. The therapy's primary mechanism of action appears to have been making the symptoms of psychological breakdown more unpleasant than returning to the front, which was its point. It was not a medical treatment in any meaningful sense. It was a coercive tool dressed in the language of medicine, and it was applied to hundreds of thousands of men across the German military medical system over the course of the war. The doctors who administered it were not universally comfortable with what they were doing. Some of them said so privately in letters and journals that have survived, but the institutional pressure was overwhelming, and the therapy continued. The gas warfare that both sides deployed from 1915 onward created its own category of institutional complexity. The first large-scale chlorine gas attack at Ypres in April 1915 produced casualties that the medical system was entirely unprepared for, not because the effects of chlorine inhalation were medically mysterious, but because the volume and the presentation of the casualties overwhelmed every system that had been established to receive them. Men who had been exposed to chlorine gas but who had not immediately collapsed frequently walked themselves to aid stations where the initial assessment was that they were not seriously injured. They appeared distressed. They were coughing. Their eyes were irritated, but they were ambulatory and responsive. Some of them were told to rest and drink water and wait to see how they developed. What the medical officers did not yet understand was that the serious pulmonary damage from chlorine exposure could take hours to manifest, during which the patient would appear relatively stable. Men who had been sent to rest in the morning were discovered dead in their beds by evening, their lungs essentially dissolved by the exposure they had walked away from. The medical documentation of these early gas casualties was fragmentative and frequently inaccurate, and the information that was extracted from it moved through the reporting chain slowly enough that it took considerably longer than it should have for adequate protective measures to be developed and distributed. The subsequent development of phosgene and mustard gas introduced casualties with presentations that were even more difficult to manage. Mustard gas in particular produced injuries that interacted poorly with the medical infrastructure of the time. Its effects on the eyes, skin, and respiratory system were severe, but they developed slowly enough that a man might not realize the extent of his exposure until hours after the fact. Mustard gas settled into low areas and clung to clothing and equipment, which meant that men who were moving through contaminated ground without knowing it were accumulating exposure over time. It seeped into dugouts and shelters. It penetrated fabric that was supposed to protect against it. The casualties it produced were not the clean, definitive injuries of shrapnel wounds. They were slow-developing, systemically damaging, profoundly painful conditions that required intensive nursing care over extended periods, which was precisely the kind of care that the military medical system was least able to provide. The records of mustard gas casualties from the later years of the war show a consistent pattern of inadequate treatment, premature return to duty, and secondary complications that were not documented as related to the original gas exposure, which meant they did not appear in the casualty statistics associated with gas warfare and contributed to a significant undercount of the total human cost of that particular category of weapon. The management of the dead was one of the war's most revealing institutional problems. No previous conflict in history had produced deaths at the rate that the First World War managed on its worst days. The Battle of the Somme on its first day, the 1st of July 1916, killed approximately 19,000 British soldiers and wounded another 38,000 in roughly 8 hours. The physical problem of what to do with 19,000 bodies in a landscape that was simultaneously an active battlefield, that was being continuously shelled, and that was in many places literally impassable, was a problem that no military planning had seriously addressed in advance. The bodies lay where they fell. Some of them lay there for days. Some of them lay there for weeks. Some of them were never recovered at all, which is why the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing of the Somme carries the names of over 72,000 men whose remains were never identified or found. These were not men who vanished mysteriously. These were men whose bodies were destroyed by artillery fire, or submerged in the mud, or buried under subsequent military construction, or simply left in areas that remained under enemy control and were never formally recovered. The official designation of missing was in many cases a bureaucratic acknowledgement that the military system had lost track of what it had done with the physical remains of the men it sent into battle. The burial details that operated in the sectors just behind the front lines were among the most psychologically damaged groups in the entire military apparatus, and also among the least documented. These were men whose assigned function was to collect and inter the dead from the battlefields, often under fire, often in conditions where the dead had been lying for extended periods in summer heat. The work they were doing was not optional, and it was not rotated. Some of these men spent months doing almost nothing else. The military authorities recognized at a practical level that this work was damaging to those who did it. But the recognition did not translate into any systematic protective measures, because the work had to be done, and there was nobody else to do it. The documentation of psychological breakdown among burial detail personnel is sparse, not because the breakdown was uncommon, but because men assigned to this work were not, in most cases, passing through the kind of medical screening that would have generated official records of their condition. They were performing a function that the institution needed performed, and the institution's interest in their welfare extended precisely to the point where their breakdown interfered with the function. The food supply in the trenches is a subject that has been treated in popular history primarily as a matter of unpleasant but manageable hardship: the bully beef and the hard biscuits and the occasional rum ration. The reality was considerably more complex and considerably more damaging. The nutritional content of the standard rations provided to British frontline troops was inadequate under normal circumstances and deteriorated sharply in the logistical disruptions that attended any major offensive operation. Trench warfare imposed caloric demands on men that the ration scale had not been designed to meet, because the ration scale had been designed for men in more static and less physically demanding situations than sustained frontline service actually involved. The physical labor of maintaining trench systems, carrying supplies, and surviving in conditions of chronic cold and wet required caloric intake that the official rations were regularly not providing. The result was chronic semi-starvation in the front lines, masked by the fact that men who were visibly wasting away were also frequently suffering from other conditions that could be held responsible for their declining physical state. The systematic measurement of frontline soldiers' nutritional status was not conducted. The data that would have revealed the extent of the nutritional deficit was never collected, because collecting it would have required acknowledging the deficit existed, and acknowledging the deficit existed would have raised questions about the ration scale that the supply system was not prepared to answer. The water supply presented a parallel set of problems. The chalk and clay geology of the Flanders battlefield made clean groundwater difficult to access, and the industrial contamination of the landscape by artillery fire, by the decomposition of enormous numbers of dead bodies, both human and animal, and by the various chemical agents deployed by both sides, made surface water essentially undrinkable without purification that was inconsistently available. Men in the trenches drank water that was officially purified and frequently was not, or that had been purified but stored in containers that had previously held fuel or chemical agents and that were never adequately cleaned. The chronic gastroenteritis that resulted was so common as to be essentially invisible in the medical statistics, appearing as a background level of illness that reduced the fighting efficiency of frontline units, but was not tracked or reported as a systematic problem because it was simply a constant feature of trench life that everybody had normalized. The men who were passing blood in their waste because of the contaminated water they were drinking were not being logged as casualties of the water system. They were being described as temporarily unfit for duty due to stomach complaints. And if they could walk and hold a rifle, they were frequently in the line regardless. Trench foot was one of the war's most preventable medical disasters and one of its most revealing examples of institutional failure. The condition produced by prolonged immersion of the feet in cold water without adequate opportunity to dry and warm them had been documented in earlier conflicts and was not medically mysterious. The treatment was straightforward. Keep the feet dry, change into dry socks regularly, apply whale oil or similar lubricants to the skin to reduce the effect of moisture. The problem was that the conditions of trench warfare made all of these preventive measures extremely difficult to implement in practice. The trenches flooded regularly. Dry socks were not always available. Whale oil was not always distributed. And the men who were responsible for maintaining the feet of the soldiers in their units, the junior NCOs and the company officers, were operating under such continuous pressure on so many fronts simultaneously that foot care was frequently the thing that got sacrificed when something had to give. The result was an epidemic of trench foot in the winter of 1914 to 1915 that disabled tens of thousands of British soldiers at a time when every available man was considered essential. The official response was to treat it as a disciplinary problem. Officers were held responsible for the trench foot cases in their units. Courts-martial were held for soldiers whose trench foot was deemed to be the result of negligence on the soldier's own part. The medical reality that the condition was produced by system-level failures in supply and rotation, and the fundamental impossibility of keeping feet dry in flooded trenches, was not the framing that the military hierarchy found useful. The framing that the hierarchy found useful was individual failure and individual responsibility, because that framing left the system itself unexamined. The British Army's use of the PALS battalions, the locally recruited units that drew their membership from single towns or workplaces or social groups, was a recruiting innovation of the early war that became one of its most quietly devastating institutional decisions. The logic was sound at the time. Men would enlist more readily if they could serve alongside men they knew. And it worked. The PALS battalions filled quickly, and the social cohesion they embodied was real and militarily useful. But the structural consequence of this cohesion became apparent on the 1st of July 1916, when PALS battalions from towns across northern England walked into German machine gun fire on the Somme and were destroyed as units within minutes. The communities from which these men came did not lose 1 or 2 men to the war on that day. They lost dozens. They lost whole age cohorts. In the small industrial town of Accrington, which had contributed 720 men to the Accrington PALS, 584 became casualties in under an hour, 235 of them killed. The town received notification of these casualties over the following days, as telegrams arrived at houses throughout the community in a sequence that made the scale of the loss gradually, horribly visible to the community as a whole, in a way that geographically dispersed casualties would not have been. The War Office, which had created the PALS system and which understood its structural implications, had made no particular contingency plan for what would happen to those communities when the human cost arrived. The notification system operated as it operated, and the communities absorbed what they absorbed, and there was no institutional acknowledgement that the PALS system had transferred a significant part of the social cost of mass casualty events from the national level, where it would have been diffuse and manageable, to the local level, where it was concentrated and devastating. The treatment of soldiers who refused to return to the front is a chapter of the war that the nations involved spent considerable subsequent effort managing narratively. The British official position was that military discipline was maintained throughout the war, and that the soldiers who were executed for cowardice or desertion were fairly tried and properly dealt with under military law. The actual record is considerably more complicated. The field general courts-martial that tried most of these cases were not courts in any procedural sense that a civilian legal system would recognize. They did not always include qualified legal representation for the accused. They frequently operated without adequate time for preparation of any defense. The death sentence, once passed by the court, moved up through the chain of command for confirmation, and the confirmation process was dominated by the attitude of the senior commander, in whose sector the case arose. General Douglas Haig, who confirmed the majority of the British executions, believed firmly that the deterrent function of the death sentence was essential to maintaining military discipline, and his confirmation decisions appear to have been influenced primarily by that belief rather than by close examination of the individual circumstances of each case. The records that survive from these proceedings vary considerably in their completeness. In some cases, the record of trial is extensive. In others, it is a few pages. In several well-documented cases, evidence that was available and that would have been material to the accused's defense was not presented at trial. The institutional conclusion, maintained officially by the British government until 2006, when it issued a blanket pardon to the executed men, was that the process had been fundamentally sound. The evidentiary record suggests something considerably less tidy than that. The use of prisoners of war as labor by all the major belligerents was technically regulated by the Hague Conventions, but in practice operated in ways that the conventions had not anticipated and could not effectively police. German prisoners held by Britain and France were employed in agricultural and industrial work that was explicitly permitted under the conventions, but were also used in roles that pushed against or exceeded the convention's provisions, including in areas subject to artillery fire and in logistical functions that directly supported military operations. British and French prisoners held by Germany were subjected to working conditions that varied enormously, depending on the specific camp and the specific local military authority, ranging from tolerable to genuinely dangerous. The documentation of prisoner of war working conditions that was collected by neutral inspection teams through the International Committee of the Red Cross shows a consistent pattern of overcrowding, inadequate food, and medical care that was essentially non-existent for working prisoners who fell sick. The reports generated by these inspections were diplomatically managed in ways that reduced their effectiveness as mechanisms for actually improving conditions, because the governments receiving them had no real institutional interest in improving conditions and considerable institutional interest in maintaining the labor capacity that prisoner populations provided. The conventions provided a framework for accountability that both sides nominally accepted and both sides systematically circumvented in ways that the accountability mechanisms were not designed to detect. The fraternization that occurred between enemy soldiers, most famously at Christmas 1914, was a phenomenon that military authorities on all sides moved quickly to suppress and then to contain, narratively. The spontaneous truces that broke out along portions of the Western Front in December 1914 were not, in the historical record, the universal experience of Christmas peace that they became in subsequent commemoration. They occurred in some sectors, and not in others. They lasted different amounts of time in different places. In some cases they were genuine and extended, with men from both sides meeting in no man's land, exchanging rations and tokens, burying their dead, and treating each other with something recognizable as humanity. In other cases they were brief and wary, and ended at the first hint of official interference. The military response when these truces were reported up the chain of command was consistent. They were to be discouraged, they were not to be repeated, and officers who permitted them were to be reprimanded. The strategic logic was clear enough. Soldiers who had spent time in no man's land with the men they were supposed to be killing were less reliable tools of industrial killing than soldiers who had not. The dehumanization required for sustained offensive operations was not compatible with the kind of contact that the Christmas truces represented. And so they were allowed to become a cherished memory of a moment of human connection, and simultaneously were effectively prevented from recurring in any systematic way. And the tension between the memory and the suppression was never examined too directly in the official histories that emerged after the war. The role of the press in managing public understanding of the war was not the result of a single coordinated policy, but of a convergence of interests between governments, military establishments, and news organizations that produced something functionally indistinguishable from comprehensive censorship. In Britain, the Defence of the Realm Act gave the government broad powers to restrict publication of information that might be useful to the enemy or harmful to recruiting, which was a definition capacious enough to encompass essentially anything that presented the war in unflattering terms. Military censors read the dispatches of correspondents at the front and removed what they considered operationally sensitive information, but the definition of operationally sensitive was applied in practice to include accurate accounts of casualty rates, descriptions of conditions in the trenches that might discourage enlistment, reports of military failures that might undermine public confidence in the conduct of the war, and accounts of the physical and psychological state of frontline soldiers that might complicate the narrative of cheerful and willing sacrifice. The correspondents who operated within this system were themselves not passive subjects of censorship. Most of them had internalized the view that their role was to maintain public support for the war rather than to document its realities, and their self-censorship was in many respects more comprehensive than anything the official censors required of them. The result was a public information environment in Britain, and to varying degrees in France, Germany, and the other belligerents, in which the information available to civilian populations bore a systematic relationship to the actual conditions at the front that was consistently tilted toward the encouraging and away from the accurate. The specific suppression of information about the tactical failures of major offensives was a consistent feature of the wartime information environment on all sides. The British public's understanding of the first day of the Somme was shaped initially by a press release from General Headquarters that described the opening of the offensive in terms that bore essentially no relationship to what had actually happened. The 19,000 dead of the 1st of July were not reported as 19,000 dead. The failure of the offensive to achieve any of its primary objectives was not reported as a failure. The information that reached the British public in the days following the opening of the Somme presented the offensive as a successful beginning to a promising campaign, and the contradiction between this presentation and the reality that was becoming apparent through the arrival of casualties in British communities was something that the public had no institutional mechanism for resolving. The men who came back from the Somme and who knew what had actually happened there were not, in general, talking. They had been explicitly told not to. They had internalized a loyalty to their units and their comrades that made disclosure feel like betrayal. And many of them simply did not have language for what they had experienced that could be communicated to people who had not been there. The informational gap between what had happened and what was known to have happened was one of the war's most significant institutional features, and it operated at every level, from the tactical detail of a single engagement to the strategic reality of whether the war was being won or lost. The British Army's senior commanders believed, with a consistency that has been a source of historical controversy ever since, that the fundamental problem of the Western Front was a problem of will and morale, rather than a problem of technology and tactics. The doctrine that emerged from this belief was the doctrine of attrition, which held that the correct way to defeat the German army was to inflict casualties upon it at a rate that Germany could not sustain, even if this required inflicting comparable or greater casualties upon one's own forces in the process. The tactical implementation of this doctrine required the repeated mounting of large-scale infantry assaults against prepared defensive positions supported by machine guns and artillery, which was an approach that had demonstrated its catastrophic cost at the Somme and at Passchendaele and at every other major British offensive of the war, and which the senior commanders continued to believe was the correct approach nonetheless. The intellectual framework within which Haig and his staff operated was one that had been formed in cavalry warfare, that understood success primarily in terms of the decisive offensive movement that broke the enemy's line and permitted the exploitation of open country, and that was systematically unable to process the evidence that the conditions of the Western Front had made this conception of warfare obsolete. The staff officers who surrounded the senior commanders were selected for their compatibility with this framework rather than for their willingness to challenge it. The intelligence assessments that reached the senior commanders were filtered through a chain of interpretation that systematically produced results consistent with the optimistic operational assumptions the commanders were already working from. The result was a command culture that was not simply ignorant of the reality it was operating in. It was structurally insulated from it. The medical reality of the major British offensives was something that the command structure received in a form that had been processed by this same insulating system. The casualty reports that reached Haig's headquarters were accurate in their numbers, but were contextualized within a framework of attrition arithmetic that made them appear tolerable as long as German casualties were estimated to be comparable. The estimates of German casualties were consistently optimistic, produced by an intelligence system that understood its role to be confirmation of operational assumptions rather than independent assessment of enemy strength. The wounded who were passing through the casualty clearing stations in their thousands were not visible to the people making the operational decisions, and the medical officers who were managing those casualties were not in a position to communicate the reality of what they were seeing in terms that the command system was designed to receive and act upon. There was no feedback loop between the medical reality of the Western Front and the operational decisions being made at Army and Corps headquarters, because the institutional architecture of the British Army did not include one. The medical establishment was a support function. Its job was to return men to duty. Its job was not to inform operational planning, and the boundary between those functions was maintained rigorously. The physical conditions in which the men of the Western Front lived for extended periods were not simply unpleasant. They were incompatible with sustained human health in ways that the military medical system was not designed to acknowledge. The trenches of the Ypres salient, which were occupied by British forces for most of the war, were built in soil that was essentially waterlogged at almost any time of year. The chalk downland of the Somme sector was more forgiving in this respect, but imposed its own particular brutalities. The forward positions that men actually occupied during quiet periods were not the carefully engineered defensive systems that survive in photographs and popular imagination. They were frequently collapsed, water-filled, inadequately revetted positions that provided marginal cover from fire and no meaningful protection from weather, from cold, from the vermin that infested every sector of the front, or from the pervasive contamination of the soil with the decomposition products of the enormous numbers of dead bodies that had been interred in it over years of fighting. Men who occupied these positions for extended tours did not emerge from them in the same physical condition they had entered. They emerged thinner, sicker, infested with lice, suffering from a range of gastrointestinal and respiratory complaints that the regimental medical officers noted and treated as best they could with the resources available, and that disappeared from the official record as soon as the men were declared fit to return to the line. The chronic degradation of physical health in the frontline soldier population was not a subject that the military medical system was organized to track or report, because tracking and reporting it would have produced data that the military system was not prepared to act on. The role of alcohol in the management of frontline soldiers is another subject that the official histories have dealt with selectively. The rum ration, the standard issue of approximately 1/8 of a pint of Navy rum to British soldiers before operations or in particularly bad weather, has become almost affectionately associated with the experience of the trenches in popular memory. The institutional reality was rather more considered than this affectionate image suggests. Alcohol was understood by military authorities on all sides as a tool of management, a way of reducing the psychological resistance of men to actions that their unaided judgment would have led them to refuse to perform. The rum ration before an attack was not primarily a comfort measure. It was a mechanism for reducing the inhibition against walking into machine gun fire that most human beings possess as a fundamental feature of self-preservation. The quantities in which alcohol was distributed before major operations exceeded the standard ration in some cases considerably, and the decision about how much to distribute and in what circumstances was made at the command level based on operational requirements rather than any consideration of the soldiers' welfare. Men who went over the top in a state of partial intoxication were not being looked after. They were being managed. The distinction was not one that the institutions involved were inclined to draw explicitly. The military discipline systems of the major powers operated during the war with a consistency of purpose and a flexibility of method that has not been fully integrated into the popular understanding of the conflict. The function of military discipline in the context of the Western Front was not to produce just outcomes in individual cases. It was to maintain the coercive framework that kept men in the line under conditions that their rational assessment of their own survival prospects would have led them to abandon. This is not a controversial historical observation. It is one that military historians have documented extensively. What is less fully integrated into the popular understanding is what this means about the individual cases within that system. Every soldier who was executed for cowardice or desertion was executed not because his individual case warranted that specific outcome on its merits, but because the institutional need for deterrence required that some soldiers be executed, and his case was the one selected by the machinery of military justice for that purpose. The process that selected him was not arbitrary in its individual steps, but was arbitrary in its ultimate determination, because the determination was not really about him. It was about the message his death was intended to send to the thousands of men who would hear about it and recalculate their own behavior accordingly. The nursing workforce that the war created essentially overnight from a relatively small professional base was subjected to working conditions and exposed to clinical realities that the nursing profession of 1914 had not been designed to handle. The volume of casualties arriving at base hospitals during major operations exceeded the capacity of the nursing staff to manage with any pretense of individual care. Nurses worked shifts of 12 hours and longer on wards that were holding twice or three times the number of patients they were designed for, treating wounds of a severity that peacetime nursing had given them no preparation for. The penetrating shrapnel wounds, the gas casualties, the traumatic amputations, the severe burns, the infections, particularly gas gangrene, which was producing limb loss and death at a rate that the antibiotic era has made it difficult for people to appreciate. These were not conditions that the nurses managing them had been trained to manage, and the training they received in the field was essentially learning by doing in conditions of overwhelming pressure. The documentation of the psychological toll of this work on the nursing staff is fragmentary, because the institutional attitude toward nursing was that women chose this work as an expression of patriotic service, and that the demands it placed on them were therefore something they had consciously accepted rather than something that was being done to them. The breakdown of nurses under the pressure of the work they were doing was recorded in ways that minimized its connection to the specific conditions of wartime nursing and attributed it instead to individual constitutional factors that had nothing to do with the institution. The systematic use of artillery on the Western Front produced environmental effects that the physical landscape still preserves and that were not fully understood during the war. The weight of ordnance delivered to relatively small areas of the Somme and Flanders over the years of the conflict exceeded anything that had ever been deposited in the earth before, and its effects on the soil chemistry, on the drainage patterns, on the structural integrity of the ground itself were comprehensive and lasting. The landscape over which the most intense fighting occurred was not simply damaged. It was physically transformed into something that had no precedent and no analog in normal human experience of the natural world. Men who moved through this landscape were not moving through anything that their evolved responses to the physical environment were calibrated to process. The shell craters, the complete obliteration of any topographical features that might have provided orientation, the absolute absence of anything growing or living over enormous areas of ground, The surfaces of mud that had the consistency and behavior of liquid but that concealed solid ground at varying and unpredictable depths below, these features of the battlefield environment created a form of spatial and perceptual disorientation that contributed to the psychological impact of the battlefield experience in ways that have been recognized retrospectively but were not understood at the time. Men who disappeared in the mud at Passchendaele were not dying in a meaningful sense in the normal way. They were being absorbed into a landscape that had been transformed by industrial processes into something that the human body simply could not successfully navigate. The artillery preparation that preceded the major British offensives was based on a theory of its own effectiveness that the evidence consistently failed to support, but that the command system was unable to discard. The theory was that sustained artillery bombardment of sufficient volume and duration would destroy the German defensive positions, cut the barbed wire in no man's land, kill or incapacitate the German soldiers in their dugouts, and permit the infantry assault that followed to cross no man's land and occupy the German trenches with acceptable losses. The evidence from the first day of the Somme, where the preliminary bombardment of 7 days' duration had failed to achieve any of these objectives in the sectors where the British infantry suffered their most catastrophic losses, did not cause the theory to be abandoned. It caused the theory to be modified to require longer bombardments, more shells, higher densities of fire, and new types of ammunition, modifications that were implemented in subsequent operations without the fundamental premise being questioned. The German response to prolonged bombardment, which was to move their garrison troops into deep dugouts that the standard British shells could not penetrate, and to bring them up when the bombardment lifted and the British infantry was crossing no man's land, was known to British intelligence from prisoner interrogations early in the Somme campaign. The information was transmitted up the chain of command and was received and was absorbed into the planning for subsequent operations in ways that made no fundamental difference to the outcome, because the planning framework could not incorporate information that contradicted its foundational assumptions. The animals of the First World War have received less historical attention than might be warranted by the scale of their involvement and the nature of their suffering. The British Army alone used over 1 million horses and mules on the Western Front over the course of the war, and the conditions in which these animals worked and died were a direct function of the same institutional indifference to suffering that characterized the treatment of the human soldiers. Horses and mules moved artillery and supplies along roads and tracks that were frequently under fire, and that were in many cases so degraded by shells and weather and traffic that they were barely navigable. Animals that were injured in the course of this work were triaged according to their utility to the military operation, and animals whose injuries reduced their utility below a certain threshold were destroyed, which was in some respects a more efficient mercy than the equivalent calculation produced for human soldiers. The veterinary corps that managed animal casualties was in some respects better organized to deal with its casualties than the medical corps managing human ones, because the institutional calculus was simpler. An animal that could not work was a liability. An animal that could be restored to working condition was an asset, and the distinction between them could be made without the kind of procedural complexity that surrounded the management of human soldiers. The horses that died on the Western Front, approximately 8 million across all the armies involved, died in ways that the generals who ordered them forward understood would kill them, and the orders were given because the operational requirement for the service those animals provided was paramount, and the cost of providing it was not a limiting consideration. The postal system that the military maintained for frontline soldiers was not the neutral conduit of personal communication that it appeared to be. All correspondence entering and leaving the frontline areas was subject to censorship, and the censorship was conducted at 2 levels. The first level was the official censor who read the letters and removed or blacked out information that violated the explicit prohibitions. No mention of specific locations, no mention of unit movements or strengths, no description of specific casualties or specific operations, no information that could assist the enemy. The second level of censorship was conducted by the soldiers themselves, who understood that letters which caused concern might result in visits from welfare officers, or, worse, in information reaching families that would cause them distress that could not be managed at a distance, and who therefore edited their own accounts of their experience before writing them. The result of these two levels of censorship was a correspondence record that, in aggregate, presents a picture of frontline life that is systematically sanitized in ways that reflect the dual pressures of official prohibition and personal protective instinct. The history of the war that can be reconstructed from the letters soldiers sent home is not a false history, but it is a history of what soldiers were willing and able to say to their families under censorship rather than a history of what they actually experienced. The gap between those two things was, in individual cases, sometimes small and sometimes enormous, and the aggregate effect of that gap on the historical record is a consistent underrepresentation of the depth and character of the suffering involved. The industrial production systems that sustained the war on all sides were themselves transformed by the demands the conflict placed on them in ways that produced their own social casualties. The British munitions industry, which expanded from virtually nothing to become one of the largest industrial enterprises in the world over the first years of the war, employed enormous numbers of women in factories producing shells and propellants and the other components of the industrial killing machine. These women were not, in general, fully informed about the specific health risks of the work they were doing. The women who worked with TNT, which caused the skin to turn yellow and was understood at the time to be toxic to the liver and kidneys, were advised that the yellowing was harmless and that the other symptoms they were experiencing were unrelated to the TNT exposure. The women who worked with other propellants and explosives were subjected to a range of chemical exposures, the health effects of which were not consistently monitored or documented. The factory management, operating under the pressure of production quotas that the military supply system was demanding on a schedule that allowed no flexibility, was not inclined to interrupt production for the purpose of investigating the health complaints of workers, and the workers themselves were operating in an environment in which the social pressure to support the war effort made raising health complaints feel like a form of disloyalty. The occupational health records from the wartime munitions industry that have survived are incomplete and have been analyzed retrospectively to suggest that the actual health impact on the workforce was considerably greater than the contemporary documentation acknowledged. The role of religion in the management of soldiers' psychological response to what they were experiencing was something that the military chaplaincies of all the major powers were asked to perform without any honest institutional reckoning with what they were being asked to do. The regimental chaplains who served with frontline units were men who had committed to a theological framework that affirmed the value of every human life and the sinfulness of killing, and who were simultaneously operating as components of an institutional machine whose primary product was killing on an industrial scale. The cognitive dissonance this produced was managed in various ways by various individuals, but the institutional requirement was that it be managed invisibly, that the chaplain perform his function of maintaining morale, conducting burial services, writing to the families of the dead, and providing what comfort was available without allowing the contradiction at the heart of his position to become visible in ways that might infect the men around him with the same crisis of meaning he was himself navigating. The theological accommodations that the wartime chaplaincy produced, the various arguments for why this particular war, fought in this particular way, for these particular purposes, was consistent with the religious commitments that the chaplains were ordained to uphold, were not, in most cases, theologically rigorous. They were functional. They were what the institution required, and the institution got what it required, and the individual cost to the men doing the requiring and the men doing the accommodating was not a subject for institutional examination. The gas mask, which became one of the war's most iconic material objects, was not a comfortable or reliable piece of equipment in the conditions in which it was actually used. The early designs were rudimentary and provided incomplete protection against the range of agents being deployed. The box respirator that became standard British issue from 1916 onward was a significant improvement, but required proper fit and maintenance to provide the protection it was designed to deliver, and the conditions of frontline service made proper fit and maintenance extremely difficult to ensure. Men who had been issued respirators that were damaged or improperly adjusted, or who had not received adequate training in their use, or who encountered gas in circumstances that did not allow time for proper fitting, received partial or no protection from equipment that was nominally present and that would appear in the unit records as adequate provision against gas casualties. The gas casualties who passed through the casualty clearing stations with respirators hanging around their necks that were fully functional but had not provided functional protection were casualties of an administrative adequacy that masked a practical inadequacy. And the distinction between those two things was not one that the reporting system was designed to capture. The repatriation of the severely disabled to Britain produced a social management problem that the government approached with considerable anxiety about public morale. Men who returned from the front missing limbs, disfigured by burns or injuries, blind, deaf, unable to speak or unable to care for themselves, were evidence of something that the government's management of the home front information environment was designed to prevent the public from seeing too clearly. The initial policy was to route severely disabled men through medical facilities that were not located in city centers to limit their public visibility, and to channel the public's encounter with disability toward the kinds of cases that could be presented as inspiring examples of recovery and resilience rather than as evidence of what the war was actually doing to human bodies. The facial reconstruction work being conducted at Sidcup by Harold Gillies, which represented genuinely innovative reconstructive surgery, was not widely publicized during the war itself, because the cases being treated there were so severe in their initial presentations that any honest account of them would have been incompatible with the public information environment the government was trying to maintain. The men who were sent to Sidcup were hidden while they were being treated, and were released into the public only when they had been reconstructed to a degree that made their cases presentable rather than disturbing. The ones who could not be adequately reconstructed remained largely invisible in the official narrative of the war's human cost. The question of what constituted a wound sufficient to remove a man from the line was one that was answered differently in different circumstances and at different points in the war, and the variation in how it was answered reveals something important about the institutional relationship between the welfare of individual soldiers and the operational requirements of the military machine. A wound that would have resulted in evacuation and extended treatment in the early months of the war, when the pressure of casualties was not yet at its maximum, might, by 1916 or 1917, have been treated at a regimental aid post and returned to duty within days. The category of wound that qualified a man for removal from immediate danger was not a fixed medical category. It was a variable institutional category that fluctuated in response to the demand for fighting soldiers and the supply of replacements. The men who were returned to duty with wounds that were not fully healed did not always survive the resumption of active service. The men who died of causes that were proximately related to wounds that had been inadequately treated before return to duty were not always recorded as dying of those wounds. They died of other causes, nominally, because the recording system was not designed to trace the causal chain backward through the institutional decisions that had put a partially recovered man back in a position where he died. The system recorded what the system needed to record, and the system needed to record soldiers as returning to duty rather than as being sent back to die of their existing wounds. The demobilization of the armies at the war's end was itself conducted in ways that produced significant human cost, while resolving the institutional problem of what to do with millions of armed men as quickly as possible. Men who had been in the trenches for years, who were suffering from conditions both physical and psychological that had never been properly diagnosed or treated, were processed through a demobilization system that assessed their fitness for civilian life in terms that were almost entirely economic, not medical. The question the system was organized to answer was whether the man had a job to return to, not whether he was in a condition to hold one. Men who were passed through demobilization and returned to their communities were frequently not in any condition to resume the functional lives the system was assuming they would resume. They were carrying physical injuries that had not been adequately treated. They were carrying psychological damage that had not been acknowledged or given any name by the institutions that had created it. They were returning to communities that had been sustained through the war years on an information diet that had prepared them almost not at all for the reality of what the men coming back had been through. The reunion of the demobilized soldiers with civilian society was not a smooth reintegration. It was a managed collision between two populations whose experiences of the preceding 4 years had diverged so comprehensively that shared communication across the divide was, in many cases, essentially impossible. The soldiers did not talk about what they had seen, and the civilians did not ask, and the silence settled over the whole of it and was called peace. The pension systems established after the war to compensate disabled veterans were designed to provide the minimum level of benefit compatible with avoiding serious political pressure from veterans' organizations, rather than to provide compensation proportionate to the actual damage the war had inflicted. The medical assessments that determined pension eligibility were conducted by boards that were simultaneously aware of the fiscal pressure on the Treasury and the political pressure from veterans, and that tended to resolve ambiguities in ways that favored the former. The psychological casualties, who were still suffering from conditions that had been given the name neurasthenia, or simply nervous debility, or similar euphemisms that carried no official recognition of the condition's connection to war service, were particularly poorly served by a pension system that was oriented toward visible physical disability. A man who had lost a hand had lost something the pension board could see and measure and calculate a percentage value for. A man who could not sleep, who experienced uncontrolled shaking when he heard a loud noise, who could not sustain employment because the conditions of workplace social interaction triggered responses he could not manage, had something that the pension board was not, in general, equipped to see, and the institutional tendency was to find reasons why his condition was not service-related rather than reasons why it was. The veterans who had sustained invisible damage from the war were therefore least likely to receive compensation and most likely to absorb the cost of that damage personally and privately, which is what most of them did, and the historical record of that absorption is primarily the record of early deaths and broken families, and the specific quietness of people who are carrying something they were never given a language or a structure to put down. The war's end did not produce any institutional reckoning with what the war had demonstrated about the relationship between industrial civilization and mass violence. The peace settlement at Versailles was organized around the question of territorial boundaries, war guilt, and reparations. It was not organized around the question of how to prevent the political and military structures that had produced the war from producing another one. The League of Nations, which was supposed to provide the institutional framework for collective security, was designed with enough compromises on its actual enforcement capacity that it was never going to be able to stop a determined major power from doing what determined major powers do. The disarmament negotiations that followed Versailles produced agreements on specific weapons categories, battleships and submarines and chemical weapons, but left the fundamental architecture of national militaries intact and did nothing to address the relationship between mass conscript armies and the political systems that directed them. The veterans who had fought the war and who retained a clear-eyed understanding of what it had involved were not, in general, the people making the decisions about the post-war order. The decisions were being made by the same types of people who had made the decisions during the war, operating within the same types of institutional structures that had produced those decisions, guided by the same fundamental assumptions about power and national interest and the utility of force that had animated the war in the first place. Within 20 years, those assumptions had produced another war that was in almost every significant dimension worse than the first one, and the institutions that had managed the First World War had provided the template for managing the Second. The memorials that went up across Britain and France and Germany and Belgium and every other nation that had participated in the war were not simply expressions of grief. They were expressions of a specific way of organizing grief that made it possible to contain the loss within a narrative framework that attributed meaning to what had happened. The names carved in stone were meant to make the dead permanent, to give them a presence in the landscape that would outlast the fading of individual memory. The ceremonies conducted at those memorials every year were meant to maintain the emotional connection to the loss in ways that prevented it from simply becoming history. But the memorials and the ceremonies were also doing something else, something more institutional. They were providing a form for the experience of the war that made it possible to hold the loss without directly confronting what the loss meant. The men whose names were on the memorial in every English village had died in a war that their government had sent them to without adequate preparation, without adequate equipment in many cases, without honest information about what they were being sent into, and without any genuine institutional concern for whether they would survive it. The memorial did not say that. The memorial said they gave their lives, which is a formulation that attributes agency to the dead that the historical record does not support, and omits the agency of the institutions that took those lives and called the taking sacrifice, and went on taking lives and kept calling it sacrifice until the available supply of lives ran out. The final accounting of the war's dead, which stands at somewhere between 17 and 20 million people, depending on how you count the military deaths, the civilian deaths from violence and famine and disease, and the deaths from the influenza pandemic that swept a weakened and dislocated world population in 1918 and 1919, was never conducted as an accounting. There was no institution with the interest or the authority to produce a full reckoning of what the war had cost, because producing such a reckoning would have required assigning costs to decisions, and assigning costs to decisions would have required assigning responsibility to the people who made them, and most of the people who made those decisions were still in positions where they could prevent that process from reaching its natural conclusions. The war ended. The accounting did not take place. The institutions that had managed the war managed the transition to peace with the same administrative competence they had brought to the war itself, which meant that the numbers were recorded, and the files were closed, and the reports were written, and the forms were filed, and the actual weight of what those forms and files and numbers represented was quietly transferred to the people who had survived the process of generating them, who carried it in silence for the rest of their lives, which were frequently shorter than they would otherwise have been, and who passed on to their children not the facts of what they had experienced, but only the shadow of it, the thing that was in the room when they were not talking, and that the children recognized without being able to name, and that became one of the things that the 20th century lived with without ever finding adequate language for, because the institutions that might have provided that language had no interest in doing so, and the people who had the experience that would have generated it had been effectively prevented from speaking it in the forms that institutions recognize and record and preserve and transmit.